All right, so we will begin our presentation here today. So good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us in the world here today. Today's topic that we're going to be discussing in the webinar is why drug availability will be the next decade's challenge and how you can prepare for it. In terms of speakers today, we are going to begin with Amaury Jeandrain. He's the head of business development engineering. Alexis Davin, the clinical supply optimization specialist, and myself, Jonathan Tabak, the account executive in clinical supply. So Enside is a software consulting company that focuses on advanced analytics and designing optimization solutions in both life sciences and energy. So Enside is a software and consulting organization that has two offices. One headquarters is in Belgium and one headquarters is in the US, and we're a little over 200 employees. Relating to life sciences specifically, what we offer is the Enside Suite, which is an end-to-end forecasting solution, and it consists of two applications. We have the supply app, which really focuses on risk-based clinical supply optimization. Then we have the production app, which focuses on building and maintaining an optimal manufacturing strategy. Also to note, we do have expert consultants on staff and really work with any clinical program, regardless of size or complexity. Some of our partners today include over half of the top 20 pharma companies, and we've optimized over 12,000 trials to date. That being said, I think Amaury will be kicking things off at this point.
Thank you very much, John, and welcome everyone to this webinar. And indeed, as John was mentioning, at Enside, we have quite some experience in optimizing clinical trial supply chain and actually handling drug availability issues in the past years. And what we're going to do today is really share some of that knowledge with you during this webinar. We're not going to talk about our solutions. We're not going to talk about our suite of optimization solutions for clinical supply chain, but we're going to talk about what we've learned by working on these trials. What were the causes and the trends that are impacting drug availability in the clinical trials? What are the main drivers that are increasing the drug waste in a trial? And finally, share some tips with you about how we've seen organizations evolve in a very efficient way in order to tackle these issues and make trials feasible despite lower drug availability. We'll definitely leave some time at the end of the session for a Q&A, so please feel free to share all of your questions throughout the presentation in the chat. We will mark them in order to keep them for the end and definitely make sure to answer those. So before we get started, let me ask you a question, actually. Have you already faced drug availability issues in your clinical trials? So normally a poll should be popping up on your screen. We just want to have a feel of the audience that we have today. Is it something that you already feel today, drug availability issues? Yes, and it does not disrupt your clinical trial development timelines. Yes, and it does impact the timelines. No, or no, but you foresee that it might become a problem in the future. And I can see already a lot of people answering. So the bad news is no one is answering no, which is really too bad, but it does illustrate the purpose of this webinar. It is something that, oh, someone answered no, great, there's a lucky person here. What we really want to highlight here is drug availability is a problem. It is something that is happening today in a lot of clinical trials, unfortunately, and we'll right away get into a couple of trends that could unfortunately increase this, but also discuss some solutions to it. And once again, I want to ask you a last question before we get into the content of this webinar. And this is not a poll. I'm going to ask you to answer in the chat. What do you think are these trends? What are the trends that you're observing on your end that could potentially make drug availability an issue in the future, or that are already making it an issue today? So feel free to write in the chat your ideas, your points. Of course, the chat is completely anonymous, so nothing will be shared. I will just read some answers out loud without mentioning the names. Just leave a couple of seconds for everyone to share some ideas here. Okay, so starting to see a couple of answers. Thank you very much. So I see someone mentioning greater barriers to distribution. Absolutely. lead times that are extremely long within the supply chain compared to the shorter lead times that we see at the beginning of the study startup. So indeed, there's a disconnect between the expectations and the reality. Vendor resources that are very limited. No resources means less drug, absolutely. Direct to patients delivery. Yeah, that could also be a problem. There's more clinical trials, indeed, and delays to upstream material capacity and resource constraints. It's very, very aligned with our own analysis. Absolutely, you will recognize probably your own issues in here. We have summarized the industry trends into 4 different categories. The first one that is evident, there is we're more and more going to face a raw material shortage. On top of this, there is also a shortage of manufacturers and CMOs. So there was a mention here of long lead times to get the supply chain set up, long lead times to get a slot, unavailability of vendors. That makes a lot of sense. There's at the same time a higher competition for the same resources. So someone mentioned here more clinical trials. This means that there's more competition for the same manufacturers and CMOs. And on the other hand, there's a lot of trends that are impacting drug waste and making waste higher and increasing waste in clinical trials, which we will also tackle today. Things like direct to patient, like regulations that put barriers to distribution. So let's jump right into it. If we focus on raw material shortages, and I'm going to mention things that you probably already know, but some resources that are used to manufacture drug for clinical trials are available in limited quantities on Earth. If we take the example of platinum that is used for a lot of chemotherapies like carboplatin or cisplatin, it is limited. It's hard to extract, it's hard to transform, but it's mostly not available in huge quantities on Earth. At the same time, we have a lot of treatments that are just complicated to obtain in large quantities because they're obtained through biologic raw materials like cells, blood derivatives, viral vectors for cell and gene. These are extremely complicated to get. We're also seeing geopolitical tensions that are reducing the access to certain resources with a very, very evident example in Ukraine with the war that's happening today over there. And we're already seeing a lot of trials today, at least an observation from inside. When comparators need to be sourced, it's already very complicated to get the right amounts of comparators for the clinical trial because of an unavailability of it. Now, if we look at the shortage of manufacturers and CMOs, again, it's an observation that I believe a lot of us are already aware of. There is definitely a shortage of manufacturers that is observed for biologics specifically, because building a bioreactor is a very long process. We've also heard a lot that during COVID, the demand for these kind of manufacturing has increased massively, and that the availability of the manufacturers was too low to actually tackle that demand, therefore increasing the lead times to get access to a bioreactor. And the same is happening to CMOs. The CMOs growth is not fast enough compared to the growth in demand today for clinical trials. Therefore, I think the waiting time today to get a packaging slot can be anywhere from 5 to 9 months, as from what I heard in the past months. Then we have an increased competition for the same resources. Someone mentioned a very large increase in the number of clinical trials. It is absolutely impressive to see that in only 10 years, the number of clinical trials has more than doubled to reach 37,000 new clinical trials in 2021, when it was only 17,000 new trials in 2010. And these trials often compete for the same indications and therefore for the same manufacturers and CMOs. But at the same time, we also have to compete with other industries. The same raw materials are used for commercial supply chain of drugs, but also for the car industries and so many other industries. I mean, platinum that I mentioned as an example is also used for batteries for cars. And all of that, sorry, put together is really increasing the cost and increasing the difficulties to get access to it, which is also making funding more complicated. So even though the resources might be accessible with a little bit of waiting time, the cost will be so high that it will be sometimes very hard for the financial resources of an organization to make it happen. And now, as a last point, we're going to talk about the trends that are impacting drug waste. And just here to illustrate, we we know that clinical trials is an industry where waste is very high. Historically, it's always been very high. The latest analysis placed the waste in the industry between 56 and 75%. It depends really on who's the source. But in the future, as we are observing a limitation in drug availability, we know that there will be, and there already is today, less and less tolerance towards these waste, this high waste that is already happening today in clinical trials. So how can we tackle that? How can we make sure to reduce that waste? In order to do so, we need to understand what are the drivers of waste in a clinical trial and the trends that will be impacting that in the future. So I'll invite my colleague Alexis now to take over to really go through all of these trends about drug waste.
Thank you, Amaury. So if we have to summarize what you just explained, basically we will have to do exactly the same job as we were doing today, but with less drug availability in the future. Well, it will be a serious challenge. And as there are a couple of trends that are decreasing the drug availability, likewise, there are a couple of trends that are increasing the drug waste. And before deep diving in this, as you said, let's first focus on the main drivers of waste. So as you know, from one clinical trial to another, the reason, the cause of the waste can be very different. And here in this presentation, thanks to the experience of Inside of more than 10,000 clinical trials optimized, we have grouped in 6 categories the main drivers of waste. The first one is the unexpected events. So indeed, we're in a never-changing world, so no surprise that one of the biggest driver of waste comes from these unexpected events. For instance, during the COVID period, we have seen recruitment to be delayed massively, and so all the kits we have produced, we couldn't give any of them to the patient because they were just not coming back to the hospital. The same way, now we can also just see a batch, we can just lose a batch or just remove a treatment arm due to a protocol amendment. This part just explains that these unexpected events will occur, they're occurring today and they will occur in the future, and we cannot really have an impact on them. Well, however, the rest of the drivers, we will see that we can have an impact on them, and especially something related to unexpected events. But we will see that in a second. And that's a pretty good segue to the second part. Indeed, a big part of the waste might also come from the planning. Indeed, when we are about to set up a clinical trial, we will first try to forecast the patient demand. And if you're working with Excel, you will also have to ensure that you have no patient risk, and so you will add a manual overage that will probably be based on previous experience of other clinical trials. But the problem by doing this is when we're doing that, we're adding a buffer on our side to ensure no patient risk, which is good. But the problem is that when we look at a trial, we should also look at the whole clinical trial supply chain. And indeed, we have other stakeholders like the packaging and sourcing or the depot resupply. And each of these stakeholders, will add a buffer on their side, a bit of margin. And at the end of the day, we have buffers on top of the others, which is massively increasing the waste. So to try to avoid this, the best would be to try to connect the dots and have this communication. The third point is related to the famous IRT. So as you know, the level of buffer we will have in a trial is, of course, a cause of waste. But because the higher the buffer will be, the higher the tendency to have a big waste will be. But the problem is that here we shouldn't focus just on this aspect, because there are others that are also causes of waste. Indeed, each clinical trial is different, and sometimes you can have simple trial, but also very complex one. And the same way, we have IRTs that are very different. So it's extremely important to choose wisely your IRT, because they don't have the same capabilities, and some might be better for your clinical trial than other. And also, it's extremely important to take the time to to custom correctly your IRT to make sure that there is no misalignment between your IRT setup and the trial design. Because this misalignment and also the misalignment with all the supply chain decisions are definitely a big part of the waste that we can experience today in our clinical trial. That leads us to our fourth point. And maybe this point, you will see the link with the first point, the unexpected events. Indeed, we have definitely a lack of monitoring and flexibility on our supply strategy. It's extremely important when an unexpected event occurs that we keep track and that we are reactive to take it into account. Because the quicker you will react to an unexpected event, the more likely you will be able to reduce the waste that it could generate. And therefore, that's why having a good visualization on your clinical trial and have the right monitoring application is definitely a good thing to try to avoid risk or to anticipate the massive waste. The fifth main drivers of waste is related to the supply chain design. As I like to say, if we had 0 day for each lead time, we would have absolutely no waste in our clinical trials. The problem is that it's not the case. A lead time to Brazil, we remain a lead time to Brazil because we've got a whole system that is constrained by regulations and also by internal constraints. So of course, there is a part of this that we cannot really change, but also a big driver of waste comes from the fact that we definitely need to align all the decisions we could make, for instance, in the supply, with all the other constraints. Because if we don't take all the different constraints into account, that's where we will increase the waste massively. And the last one is the trial design. Big decisions are taken during the trial design phase. Indeed, most of the time, the supply team has no point to make on the country list or on the kit design, but these decisions are impacting a lot the supply team. So something that we see as a driver of waste is that during this trial design, as the supply team are not extremely involved, we don't see really the impact that a small decision on the protocol can have on the supply chain. But so now we explained the 6 big categories and we gave a couple of examples. But let's try now to put some probabilities on this. Indeed. So what we see is the 2 main drivers are the trial design and the supply chain design. Aside, we also have the monitoring, then the IRT strategy, the planning, and the unexpected events. What is interesting here in this pie chart is that first we see the monitoring has an even bigger impact than unexpected events, which means that your reaction to an unexpected event is extremely important in terms of waste. And also, we can see that the IRT is not so big compared to a couple of years ago. And that's just because now we can see that people are knowing more and more about this technology, which is really great and that helps reducing the waste. So we have discussed the current drivers of waste, but as Amaury mentioned, we have a couple of trends that are also not a very good news for the clinical supply because they won't make the supply chain for clinical trials easier. The first one is the trial complexity, and this refers to one of the biggest driver of waste, which is the trial design, because now we can see that we are going to a world where the trials are becoming more and more complex. We have more protocol amendments, more sites, and that is going with the fact that we are also having more and more regulations, which is a link to the supply chain design. We have more regulations because we want to be in a more transparent world to protect the patients, which is good, but that is also complexifying the supply chain for clinical trials. A third point is also drug. As Amaury mentioned, we're now working with biologics. Well, these drugs have shorter shelf lives, We've got also longer manufacturing lead times. So this is clearly a good highway to increasing the waste. And all these 3 points are going with the fact that now the biggest industry trend is that we want to accelerate our timelines. We don't want anymore to wait 10 years to commercialize a drug. Now we want to make it faster, and to be able to make it faster, we need it, this comes with putting more means and to increase the waste. So now I will give the floor back to Amaury, that will explain you the tips to tackle waste in your organization.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Alexis. So indeed, there's a lot of things that are happening today. Some things that we can control, other things that we cannot control. Definitely the trends that are currently impacting drug availability, like the amount of resources on Earth or the availability of CMOs and manufacturers, is not something that we can solve like that in a couple of seconds. It takes years to create a bioreactor. Well, just replenishing the resources of platinum in the world is not something we can handle ourselves. What do we have control on, though? It's really on the waste levels in our clinical trials. So what we're going to share now in the next steps of this webinar is some tips on how to tackle waste in your organization and how to organize your team and your structure in order to tackle it. So we're going to share a couple of good practices, basically, that we've observed that worked very well with our clients. And before that, I wanted to ask you the question, I wanted to ask you the question, what have you already implemented in your organization to tackle drug waste in clinical trials? So once again, feel free to use the chat to share your answers. I'll leave you a couple of seconds to share it. Once again, all your answers will be completely anonymous, and I'll just read some of them out loud just to comment on this question. So what are you putting in place in your organization to tackle drug waste? Okay, some answers are already coming. Great, so we have drug pooling, late stage manufacturing. We've got KPIs, improved consideration for drug pooling. There's dedicated forecasting team, absolutely. Great. Yeah, thank you very much for participating. And actually, the first tip is indeed to start tracking the waste very seriously. It might seem logical, of course. You might think, hey, why did I connect to this webinar if this is the first tip? But it's really important. We need to track the waste. We need to track it correctly. We need to track it in the right way. And we need to track it and adapt it throughout the clinical trial at all times. And when we are referring to waste in the clinical trials of our own organization, we need to really refer to the waste at the end of the clinical trial, not the waste that we have initially thought was going to happen at the beginning of the trial, the initial assumption that we made, but really the one that is the real waste at the end of the trial. And for each of the tips that we're going to be sharing here, we'll be illustrating with a quick case study. So Alexis, if you want to go ahead with the first one.
Sure. So this case study illustrates exactly the theory you just explained to us, Amaury, because in this case, we were following a study over time, and we were tracking the waste. So initially, we forecasted 42% of waste. And what we see is along the trial, we first had an increase of the waste due to the fact that the recruitment was delayed, which is a common fact in clinical trials. And then what is interesting is after a couple of months and a couple of events, we had first a study ongoing, then we had unexpected events related to the titrations. And thanks to an update of the supply strategy and to close the different sites, we were able at the end to decrease this waste to end up with a 32% of waste. So that's clearly a good point to show that by tracking the waste, and that definitely the waste is a kind of dynamic number, by tracking that, we can see that we are about to take better decision. And maybe if we didn't track it during the time, maybe we would have reached 50% of waste with the fact that the recruitment was delaying. But thanks to this small update and to remain adaptive, we were able to decrease it until 32%.
Yeah, that's right. It's all about tracking, but also reacting to events that would potentially make waste higher. And we really need to make sure that we put the right actions in place to avoid that. Now, 1B, track all waste. And again, it might seem logical, but I have heard a lot of ways that waste was tracked at different organizations. And I've heard some organizations that consider, for example, that leftover capsules in a kit that was dispensed to a patient during reconciliation was not being considered as waste. Site buffers was not being considered as waste because it's the necessary buffers that we need for the trial to actually happen. What I would really recommend here is to consider everything that is not consumed by patients as waste. And I do agree, we need waste in clinical trials. It is mandatory. There's nothing we can do to actually avoid 100% of the waste in clinical trials. But if we have a complete tracking that really shows at all stages of the clinical trial where our waste is coming from, that's how we're going to be able to find the right actions to tackle waste at each of the different locations. So a formula that I would recommend to calculate the waste is really, if you look at the drug product level, so number of capsules, milliliters of drug product, you take whatever was consumed by patients, you divide it by, you take whatever was not consumed by patients and you divide it by everything that was allocated to the clinical trial or to everything that was manufactured, if you actually track it all the way up to the drug substance. And that should be your calculation of waste. And it's going to be a high number, unfortunately, but it will allow to really understand at each stage how waste is handled.
Indeed. We have now another case study to illustrate your point, Amaury. So in this one, indeed, tracking the waste is extremely important. And what is extremely important as well is to be able to locate the waste. In this example, it's a clinical trial also with bottles fulfilled with caps. And what we see is we were able to identify the quantities of waste at central depot, local depots, at site, but also all the unused caps from a bottle. And what is interesting with this kind of graphs is that by tracking the waste and by being able to locate them, you're also able to put your energy in the right place. Because in here, for instance, if you want to put a big focus on the unused, well, basically it will show you, all right, we have a big amount of capsules that are just not used. Maybe we could change the kit design and maybe we would be able to reduce this unused waste. Aside of that, you could also consider, which makes sense in here, to put your focus on the waste at site. We can see here that it is clearly the big place where the waste is located. And there are solutions. You can, for instance, try to adapt a new RRT strategy, change the resupply frequency or the buffer or many different things, depending on your trial. But it means that you can potentially put energy on this and try to reduce this waste. And there are also other examples for waste at local depots or at central depot. And for each of them, it can be specific to your trial, but what is very interesting is by tracking the waste and being able to locate it, you can try to tackle the right place where you will have an impact.
And this case study is really part of a larger one. And if you're interested to see that one, it's actually a case study where we looked at every location of the waste and implemented solutions to reduce it at every step of the supply chain. The results were quite interesting. We went down from a waste of like 75% to a waste of 15% by implementing these results. So if you're interested, just let us know after the webinar. We'd be happy to share this specific case study with you. The second recommendation, and it's one that was mentioned also in the first answer, is having a dedicated team, a dedicated forecasting team, or at least a dedicated team that has as a specific role and objective to track waste throughout the supply chain, to optimize waste management and implement innovative solutions to minimize that waste. Of course, typically, this would be part of a clinical supply chain planning or forecasting optimization, but sometimes we've even seen in some organizations one or two people that have an end-to-end optimization role. These people must be supported by the right systems. The systems that are used should be able to track and evaluate waste at all times and at all stages of the supply chain, as well as assess the impact of strategic decisions on the supply chain and provide an end-to-end view on everything that's happening in the supply chain, on all of the decisions that are taken that could impact waste from the very early stages of manufacturing, even if we're talking about the bill of materials for the raw materials, downstream towards the patient and when the drug is actually dispensed to the patients. Because at every step, there is going to be something that can be done to tackle waste.
Absolutely. And here we're again with a short case study, because in any organization, there are different parts of the supply chain, from manufacturing to the delivery of patients. In here, for instance, it's possible that there is one vendor responsible for the drug substance phase, another vendor for the drug product, and a third vendor for the packaging. And the point is that rings a bell with what we were explaining earlier. It's that in a supply chain, you will have different stakeholders. And if they're acting as silos, completely independently, it means that they will all have a tendency to add a small margin, a small buffer. And the problem is that they're just basically not connecting the dots. And if we are not connecting the dots, we're just increasing the waste. And so in this example, we have in orange the initial calculation with this functionment of different stakeholders and the buffers on top of the other. And if we look at the optimized situation that we suggested with an end-to-end planning that really tried to tackle and to take into account the buffer that was needed, we saw that we were able to decrease from 40% the total number of capsules that were needed to be produced. And so this just shows that connecting the dots can have a major impact on the total forecast and on the quantities to be produced, and therefore on the waste.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Alexis. Which is a very good segue, actually, to the next point. To enforce joint and data-driven decisions. Why joint? Because, as Alexis explained a bit earlier, a lot of the decisions that are taken in a clinical trial are not taken by the supply chain team. The protocol design, the selection of the IRT system is often taken outside of supply chain. The manufacturing strategy, the list of countries that will participate. There's so many things that are happening where supply chain has little control, but that have themselves a huge impact on the amount of waste that will happen in a clinical trial. And second, data-driven decisions. So they must be taken together, but they must be supported by data. And when we say data, it's really put a number on every decision. If we decide to go for protocol version number 1 instead of protocol version number 2, what's the impact on the supply chain? How much is it going to cost us in additional drug and additional waste? Or how much is it going to save us? We need to make sure that we have data. Not that it's going to drive the decision in the direction of a positive supply chain, because sometimes, of course, there's patient centricity consideration, investigator centricity consideration, regulations, and a lot of other things that need to be taken into consideration. But by doing this, at least we are able to make informed decisions, and we understand the impact of what these decisions will do to the supply chain. And once again, we have a quick case study to illustrate that.
Indeed. So completely aligned with what you just mentioned. In this case study, it was a trial that was at the trial design phase. And what is interesting in this part is, as we mentioned earlier, the supply is not always involved or just partially involved. And what is interesting is that in here, the different decisions that were discussed during the protocol design were modeled, and we had a KPI to show the impact on the supply chain. For instance, increasing the minimum screening period, had the direct impact to minimize by 4,500 tubes the total production. what is interesting, the same for kit design. We see that depending on one or another kit design, we could increase by 3,000 the number of tubes to be produced. But what is interesting here is that at this stage, it's really interesting to be able to put a number in just aside the decision to ease the discussion, and also to understand, okay, maybe this decision is not safe enough for a patient, so we shouldn't do it. But maybe this one would be totally aligned with the patient safety and would have a huge impact on the supply. And so that's just basically how to have a KPI next to a decision to ease the discussion. And also what is interesting is therefore you can centralize all the points related to a trial and test scenarios.
And again, a good segue to the fourth point here in our recommendations. It is often thought that if you have a good system and you have good data, you're going to have good forecasts. It is very much underestimated how much the proper use of the data can be a threat. Even if you have the right data, not using it in the right way can really be something that can cause a lot of waste, but also risk in your supply chain. We've observed this a couple of times in the past, that all the data was available, but the way that the team was doing the forecast and using the data and transforming the data into a forecast was not correct. Therefore, it creates, well, additional drug waste, but also some firefighting when the trial is ongoing to adapt to what's currently happening and correct the issues that would be created by this misuse of data. And we've actually made a whole webinar about this, in case you're interested, about the topic on how to get the right data, how to use the data in a proper way. Let us know again if you're interested in getting the link to that webinar that we did a couple of months ago. We'd be very happy to share it with you.
Oops, sorry, I changed the slide also. So indeed, we have another case study to illustrate what you just explained, Amaury. And in this case study, we had an oncological trial, and the assumption was that on average, the patient were staying 15 months in the trial. What is interesting is, depending on how can you forecast, because that's the big point, how would you forecast the average demand? Depending on the way you will do it, you can have very different results. And for instance, if you were doing it on an Excel file, you will have you can, for instance, interpret this assumption and use this assumption as all the patients are going to finish their treatment after 15 months. However, in reality, there is variability, and this variability will therefore be more like the green curve, and because you will have then patients that will stay shorter and longer in the trial, which is what is going to happen in reality. And the point is that if we stick to a plan where all the patients are staying 15 months and no more, no less, well, at the beginning, we will produce more, as we can see in the first part of the graph. We will produce more than is probably needed. So we will increase the waste. And aside of that, we are not taking into account that the patient could stay longer. So when the trial will be ongoing for a while, after all these last patients that will stay longer, we will just basically not have planned anything for them. So we're at that moment increasing the risk for these patients. So this is just a good example of the fact that even if you got the right system to calculate your forecast and your demand, the problem by misinterpreting a data or an assumption can lead to waste or risk. Now I'll let the floor again to Amaury.
Thanks, Alexis. And the close to last point for this presentation is to work with the right partners and the right systems, and to really know what to look for. In a CMO, we're looking at reduced lead times. We're looking at flexibility to arrange packaging and labeling and to postpone or advance them in case we have a need for that set flexibility. We're looking for an efficient network with depots available in the countries in which we are conducting the clinical trial in order to reduce the lead times to get to the site. we're looking, well, of course, at the CMO, also the way that they manage transportation to minimize excursions, for example, and so on. For IRT systems, we'll be looking at systems that have a very good resupply algorithm. It wasn't too much the focus a couple of years ago, but there has been a really, really good improvement in the power of resupply algorithms in the recent years. And these algorithms should really match the trial design. There are really good IRTs for oncological trials. There are really good IRTs for trials with a lot of titrations. And there are really good IRTs for other trial designs. We just need to make sure that the resupply algorithms capabilities are matching the need of the trial, and that they have capabilities to customize the algorithm in order to match what needs to be implemented to make the trial more efficient and be adaptable. Because when the trial's ongoing, we're going to want to change the configuration of the IRT and to adapt it to what's happening to make sure that we keep control on our waste. And finally, there was a couple of mentions to forecasting and optimization. Selecting the right forecasting and optimization system is important. And to do that, we need to check the algorithms. And the algorithms are going to be very different from one system to another. Some of them are going to offer simulation algorithms and actual optimization algorithms using mathematical models. Others are going to offer aggregation and forecasting, which is very similar to what can be done in an Excel, but with an automated interface. One very important recommendation: don't let the overage be an input. Make sure that you can put a number on every decision that you take with these systems. And again, to make a link to the previous point, that it can consider the data in the right way, that it's not just inputting data and using it in a way that might be not fitting the needs of the clinical trial. And so these are really the five most important points in our perspective on how to organize a structure to minimize waste. So just to summarize it all very quickly, the first point, we talked about tracking all the waste very seriously, to have a complete visibility on where waste comes from and how it's evolving throughout the clinical trial, to build a structure to actually do that, track it, manage it, find innovative solutions to reduce it, enforce joint and data-driven decisions, so create more connections with your other teams, clinical operations teams, more connections with your CROs, your CMOs, your IRT teams, to make sure that all of the decisions that are taken can be assessed with a number, and therefore understand the impact that it has on the supply chain and on waste. Then getting the right data. I know that it's complicated, but it is something that is absolutely important. Getting the right data, use it correctly, but also make sure to challenge that data, because we know that some assumptions that we take are never correct. And work with the right partners and the right systems. And finally, I'd like to add a sixth one as really the last take-home message: gather and share learnings. When the trial's over, go back to it. Look at your trial. What happened? Take a look at your data accuracy. Were the clinical forecasts on target? How can you improve them in the future? Chain correct, average, your lead times, your internet problem. I seem to be back. So, how did you do? Did you have to react to a lot of events? How did you able to minimize the impact that they had? How efficient were your partners in supporting the clinical trial? Was the collaboration efficient with the other teams? Perform also a retrospective analysis. Take your trial and create this graph that we showed a bit earlier that shows the evolution throughout the trial. How did the waste evolve? How accurate were you in setting the waste at the beginning of the trial and to actually keep it real? What are the drivers of the waste in that specific trial, and what can you learn from it to reapply it in the future to avoid higher waste? So really learning, sharing the learnings, and applying those learnings for future projects is extremely important. All of the previous steps are important too, but if you don't learn from what's happening today, from all of the actions, and implement those learnings into the future, it's also going to be quite hard to continue improving. Because I can promise you one thing: it works. It does work very, very well, actually. From an industry average of 70% of waste, organizations that we work with that have implemented some of these changes and that really strongly track their waste and work on innovative solutions to reduce it, that collaborate together, are able to reduce their drug waste to anywhere between 22 and 35%. 22% if the supply chain team is able to influence protocol decisions and strategic decisions that are taken generally outside of their team. So yeah, this is basically the conclusion from our webinar today. I hope you have enjoyed the content. We now have about 15 minutes for questions, so please feel free to share them on the chat. I know that we already have about 15 that we're going to answer. If you have any other questions, feel free to share them on the chat. We will right away select a couple of the questions that were asked to answer them, and if we don't have the time to do so today, we will follow up by email and make sure to do so. So let's take a first one here. So the first question is, can you give an example of what alignment optimization you did for building the right structure? It seems difficult when working with different vendors. Yes, I agree. It is definitely a challenge. What we have done in the past was to work as the main point of contact, the main project manager for the waste across the program. What is important here is if you take a program, a whole program with multiple clinical trials, and you take everything from early manufacturing to the very last stage and the dispensing to the patients, you need one person that participates to all of the discussions that happen with all of the teams that are taking strategic decisions. First of all, where do we manufacture? Do we outsource? Who do we outsource to? How do we build our scale-up strategy for the phase 3? What's our stability planning? We need to have someone that looks at those decisions and puts a number on them. Then we need to look at how to allocate the drug to each of the clinical trials, which means that each of the clinical trials individually needs to be optimized. So we need that same person to also look at the protocols, at the country list, to look at the kit design, and really assess the impact that these decisions are going to have on the supply chain, optimize the supply chain strategy, the vendor selection, IRT, CMO, and connect it with the manufacturing in order to optimize the allocation of drug to each of the clinical trials. And when the trial is ongoing, you need to have a monitoring application and keep a visibility on what's happening and make sure to react as soon as unexpected events happen. We know this is quite frequent, every 2 to 3 months. It's not something also that you want to be running every week, but you need the solution that you've implemented should be robust enough to get you going for a couple of months. So I agree with you. This is not an easy thing to implement. It's a full-time job for someone that is working on 2 to 3 programs a year, for sure. But it is, again, definitely worth it. It's someone that is going to be coordinating a lot of decisions, participating in a lot of different meetings, and reporting also on the evolution of waste. I hope this answers your question. So let's have another question here. So there's a question about drug pooling. So there's this person here that uses drug pooling to reduce waste. Is it an efficient method in our experience? It can be very efficient in some cases. It could be a bit less efficient in other cases, and let me explain myself a bit better here. If you have a trial where your shelf life is very short and you're going through shelf life extensions because you're in a stability planning, drug pooling can be extremely efficient because it allows you to have unlabeled lots that you can quickly extend the shelf life for and reassign to clinical trials over time. As soon as you start getting larger shelf lives, drug pooling loses its appeal because it's increasing your shipping lead time, increasing your costs, because, well, each shipment is going to be a packaging or a labeling action. If you have a good planning, you don't need to use drug pooling as soon as you get longer shelf lives. That's basically our analysis in 2 seconds. I think we still have 10 minutes. So what other questions do we have today? We have one here about drug waste. How do we monitor trial waste? That's a really good question. It's a matter of really a different time points of the clinical trial, comparing 2 things. First of all, what has been produced in the past with what is planned to be produced in the future, as well as what has been consumed in the past, along with what is going to be consumed in the future. So at every time point of the clinical trial, be able to have these 4 KPIs and make the basic formula of what has not been consumed out of what was produced to have your percentage of waste. It's something that's quite easy to calculate, honestly, as long as you have the 4 KPIs that I just mentioned, which you can easily find in your IRT system. You've got the batch releases, that's the past productions. You've got your past demand, that's available in the IRT system. You know what your future productions are going to be if you're using a forecasting solution. And you also know what your future demand is going to be if you're using a forecasting solution. So you've got the 4 numbers. All you have to do is divide the kits that will not be consumed by the ones that were produced, and you've got your waste. So your system might be able to do this automatically. If not, you could also do it in an Excel sheet. It's a couple of minutes to get the number done, and it allows you to have very good visibility on how that number evolves over time. So let me see, there's other questions that we could check for here. So there's a question about trial design that is not a supply chain responsibility, and how could it make it acceptable for supply chain to influence clinical operations and trial design? So it's a very frequent question. We get this very, very often because indeed it's not in the supply chain's responsibility to impact the protocol design, or definitely to make decisions in the protocol design, but KPIs talk by themselves. If you have facts, if you have numbers, and you can show that by maybe adding 1 visit in the protocol, you could save $5 million worth of drug, it definitely helps the discussion. We've been able with KPIs like these to change small decisions in the protocol that are really not impacting patients very much, but are impacting supply chain massively. If I have to give an example, maybe there's a time I remember where there was a trial with a visit window of ±2, and just changing that visit window to +2 instead of ± was saving $2 million worth of drug. We presented that to the person who wrote the protocol, and it was automatically implemented in the protocol because the impact on the patients was very low, while the impact on the supply chain was extremely high. So yes, impacting protocol design and trial design is not easy, but at least when you have the numbers, it starts a discussion. It's not a guarantee that's going to happen, but it might be a first step to get there. So we have another question here. In our opinion, what are reasonable industry standard timelines for CMO to perform a packaging and labeling campaign? That really depends on the CMO. It really depends on the drug that we're talking about. It depends on whether we need the label on the primary, the secondary packaging. It's very complicated to know all of that. It depends on the work that your QP needs to go through in order to release the batch. Anywhere from 1 month to 4 months. I've seen a bit of everything. Of course, ideally, the faster the better. If a CMO has a very good process and you're able to get your drug packed and labeled and released within a month, and actually the most important thing, you're able to finalize and block the order only a couple of weeks before it actually happens, and still change the date around and the quantities around until the last minute, that's even better. I know it's completely unrealistic to hope that for most CMOs, but it's something that you should definitely try to get, ideally. So we still have 5 minutes, so I'll take a last question that we can answer here. Did we see a lot of companies that are not tracking waste or tracking waste in a different way? Yes, definitely. I mean, not tracking waste is the easiest way. I think a lot of small companies, small to medium-sized pharmaceutical companies don't yet track waste, because the most important point is really to get drug to the patients, to get the drug commercialized. Now, in terms of waste tracking in a different way, yes, that happens. We were mentioning earlier that a lot of companies consider that everything that was dispensed to patients is not wasted. So any remaining capsules in a kit that were not consumed by a patient after reconciliation are not considered as waste. That site buffers are not considered as a waste. That basically the overage is what's dispensed to patient plus site inventories plus depot inventories, and you multiply that by an additional overage. So that's the way a lot of companies calculate it. So they consider that the overage does not include the site buffers and the depot buffers and the waste in the patient's home. It happens often, but it's something, of course, that would ideally be avoided, because site inventories and depot inventories waste can be avoided. It's something that with good planning and a good supply chain can be reduced massively. So yeah, we still have a couple of questions, but we'll make sure to answer those by email so that we can finish today's webinar right on time. So I just want to thank everyone for your participation today, for your participation in the polls, the questions, for really being active today. It was really great to present this to you. We're completely available if you need any follow-up, if you want to have a quick catch-up meeting right after this to discuss some of these points into more details. So thanks again. Have a great rest of the day, and see you very soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you for joining.